My name is Brooke Edmonds, and I am with Oregon State University Extension, and I'm going to be helping to moderate the session today. So my job is to help with the questions. So if you put your questions in the Q&A, I will read them off and we'll get them answered. There's a lot of people online today, so if we don't get to your question, we'll try to answer them at a later time. So let me do a little introduction here before we let them take it away. So Dr. Mellifera is an assistant professor who is leading OSU's efforts to design, implement, and evaluate a statewide pollinator health program. He provides training to pesticide applicators on how to reduce pesticide exposure to pollinating insects. He hosts a weekly podcast on pollinator health called Pollination, and is currently working to help homeowners and landscapers better understand how to manage pests while minimizing impacts to pollinators. So we'll let him share his screen and take it away.
And I just want to start off. I can see you all there from Colorado, all the way to the East Coast, North Carolina. And I want to ask you to begin with. We'll start with a poll. What best describes you? If you had to put yourself into one of the following categories, what would you categorize yourself? And one of the options is none of the above. Are you primarily a person who keeps bees? Do you garden and are interested in bees, or do you actually like garden for bees? Or are you simply just curious about bees? Why are you here today? And I'm sure for a lot of you, you fall in a lot of categories, but choose the best one.
Okay, just another 5 seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now, and I'll share the results. Let us know if you can see those.
Okay, I can see them. It's like you're mostly gardeners and you're interested in bees today. This is great because this is what this presentation, if you were gardeners for bees, you'd already be at the point at the end of the presentation, so our learning objectives would already be met. So this is super. Okay. So there are our learning objectives for today. What I want to do by the end of this session is that you should be able to identify, and all of you can do this, identify 5 really cool bees that you'll find in your garden. I guarantee you'll see these, and by the end of this session, you'll be able to identify them. And the second thing is I want you to go home today with 10 concepts going into next year to build a pollinator habitat in your backyard. I think these are really doable objectives. And let's just begin by this basic question. Who are the backyard bees? So let's say you walk out of this very hip 80s music kind of seminar that we've just come out of, and you run into this 90s guy or 2000s guy. This is Enrique Iglesias, and he comes up to you and says, "Hey, I want to know more about the bees. Like, tell me what you know about the bees." Let's say he's on a very curious day and he asks you, well, just how many species of bees would we have in a state like Oregon? So we're going to launch a second poll here, and I want you to take a stab of how many bees do you think? And we've got a bunch of categories here from 1 to 5 species of bees, so distinct species of bees, all the way up to more than 1,000. So go ahead and cast your votes. I'm really curious how many bees you think we have. And I think that third category there should be 11 to 50 instead of 1 to 50.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, so we've got this really nice distribution, and for somewhere around 11 to 500 bee species is what people think, and that's really great. For this poll was originally, I thought of the idea talking to authors of a book I'm going to talk about in a minute, who polled a number of Americans and asked them how many bee species there were, and they really underestimated the number of species. But you are actually, this audience is really on top of it. We're thinking that in the state of Oregon, we don't really know for sure that we're looking at about 500 species of bees. And we don't know exactly for sure, for the good reason that a lot of the species are hard to tell apart. And so it ranges all the way from some of this big carpenter bee. We have these in southern Oregon and a lot of the southern states. You'll see these big carpenter bees, all the way to these small ground nesting bees, these Perdita. This is Perdita minima, the smallest bee that we have in the United States. So I'm going to come up with another poll here, just looking at these bees. If we look at these bees, we say we have a lot of bees, and some bees are native bees. They've been here, and some bees are introduced bees. If you look at this slide, we've got 4 bees on here. Man, I already gave part of it away. So we know there's 4 bees. How many of these bees are native? Some of these don't look like bees. That was part of my giveaway there. But how many of these bees do you think are native to North America?
Okay, keep still seeing votes come in, so we'll just take another 10 seconds. Okay.
Okay, great. The answer is 3. We have, and the kind of peculiar thing that might have been a little bit odd to some of you is that some of these are bees. On the bottom, we have that green-looking insect, and that insect that looks a lot like a yellow jacket. These are, in fact, bees. All of them are bees, and the only bee here that's introduced is the honeybee, Apis mellifera, and we'll get to know all of these bees in the course of the webinar. But just take a look here. We've got, here's 2 insects. You can see bees are really distinct from other insects that visit flowers. You can see on the left, we've got a bumblebee, and the bumblebee is got these big, long antenna. If we go back and take a look at her, she's furry. She's got 4 wings. You can't quite see it, and a very long tongue. But if we look on the right at what is a fly, this is actually a fly on the right. It's striped. It looks like a bee. But if we just watch her carefully, on the front end of her head, she's got right around here, she doesn't really have fully formed antenna. There are these arista, these small little antennas that she has on her. And let's see if we can. There we go. And also, you'll see she only has 2 sets of wings. And also, look at her tongue. It's kind of going down in a downward motion. It's kind of going in and out of her head. It's a lot different than when we looked at the bumblebee in the other slide. It has this big, long tongue, and it's probing into the flowers. So if we look at these kind of broad characteristics, number of wings, the shape of the antenna, how they fly, you can get a rough idea of who's a bee and who isn't a bee. I think we're stuck with that little annotation, but I kind of like that little purple there anyways. I'm going to point out 2 really good resources. For those of you who are in Oregon, we have this free publication, Common Bee Pollinators of Oregon Crops, which I'll be using through the webinar to kind of different bee species. But I really want to draw your attention to this wonderful publication. I'm sure many of you already have it. It's called The Bees in Your Backyard. Joseph S. Wilson and Olivia Messinger-Carroll. Excellent book. It really it's written in such a style for a beginner that you can go all the way to working to be genera. So it's an amazing book. It's very affordable. And also in Oregon, we do have this thing, the Oregon Bee Project, where we have a lot of resources in the state that we're starting to compile. Now, when we go back to that poll, and we think for a lot of Americans, they think that there's maybe 5 species of bees in their state. There's reasons for this, obviously. One of them is popular culture. And here we have Pooh Bear. He's on a big column of honey buckets, and he's going to launch Piglet into this supposed bee colony. So what is sort of being implied here is we have the honeybee that makes honey is being depicted here. But what we have is a wasp nest. Honeybees, as you'll learn, don't make these nests that hang off of trees out of paper. These are actually wasps. And so there's a lot of confusion with the public about who the bees actually are. And of course, this might be one of the solutions. We can just deal with culture as a whole, or maybe as master gardeners, I think a lot of you are, there's this big role that you can take in terms of educating the public. So as Brooke mentioned earlier, OSU does have this podcast called Pollination. It's a weekly podcast about people who are involved in pollinator health. And in our very first episode, we had this bold claim by Dr. Francis Ratnieks, who said, well, bees are just hairy vegetarian wasps. Hairy vegetarian wasps. That's what a bee is. It's kind of like a wasp, and that's in fact true. They are their closest relative. They share. They come from the wasps. They're a kind of derivation of wasps, but they're hairy and vegetarian. And what we mean by vegetarian is, unlike wasps and a lot of other pollinators, they derive their protein not from meat, and of course, not the meat that you have on your picnic table or with some paper wasps. They're going to insects and aphids and picking them up. That's not where the bees get their protein from. They're getting it from the flowers themselves. This big pile of yellow stuff that this honeybee is collecting as she visits a willow catkins. So this is what makes the bees distinct. Of all the 4 major groups of pollinators we have in the US, honeybees derive all of their nutrition entirely, bees derive all their nutrition from flowers. And where all the rest of them, even the hummingbirds, for example, will get some protein from eating insects, the bees really get everything from flowers. And in this picture, you can see the 2 things they're getting. At the base of the flower, they're sticking their long straw-like tongues down to suck up this nectar, this juicy fluid at the bottom of the flower. But in the process, they're rubbing up against the anthers, the organs that produce the male reproductive pollen, pick up the pollen on their bodies, and in the process, of course, they're transferring the pollen to the flower stigma and helping to set seeds. But what you can see here, the bee, when she leaves, a lot of that pollen is not ending up on the stigma, it's ending up on her body. She's collecting it on her body, she's piling it up into these piles, and she's bringing it back to feed to her young. It's a very important innovation that has occurred with bees, and this is what makes bees such great pollinators. In fact, the distinguishing feature of bees, if you really get down on your hands and knees and look, is that their hairs are distinct. Whereas wasps sometimes are hairy, their hairs look very shiny. Bees have this kind of branched hair that act kind of like a baleen whale. They're kind of like going through the environment, just kind of raking in the pollen and bringing it back to the nest. In the process, they're doing this valuable pollination service back to things like crop plants, but also to a lot of wild plants we have. Okay, to our learning objectives. So here we go. Cool bee number 1 is the honeybee, Apis mellifera, and it is a weird bee in Oregon. It's a weird bee nationally. It just doesn't really behave like any of the other bees. And the people who keep them, are also peculiar. The beekeepers, they keep these bees in these boxes, and I have never met a stranger group of people in my life. Love them dearly. But the bees really don't need the beekeepers to live. In fact, to this day, unlike a lot of other domesticated animals, they're perfectly willing to take up residence in what they evolved in, these cavities, these tree cavities. And you can see here a cutaway from one of Dr. Tom Seeley's excellent books on honeybee biology. Inside, there's this comb that we grew up knowing. They build it, they attach it inside the cavity, they draw it down, and in this comb, they have their honey, their nurseries, everything is self-contained. It's kind of like IKEA, these wax cells, or this modular unit that they use for raising their young in. But the thing that makes them weird is really the fact that they're extremely social. So of all the bees that we're going to look at in Oregon and in the United States, they never attain this level of sociality. So you have all these bees that are going out. They're all sisters. These are the worker bees. They're going out collecting the pollen. You can see them coming back into the colony, the pollen on their back legs. And they're dividing their labor up so that some of them are collecting the food, some of them are making that wax substrate that they raise their young in. The queen, her only job is to lay eggs, and the workers work collaboratively to nurse those larvae into another generation. This is a perennial colony. It doesn't go into hibernation through the winter. It's active the whole year round. And the other thing that makes honeybees distinct and weird is that they make honey. Here you can see that there's that nice long tongue that all the bees have these tongues. Some of them are longer, some of them are shorter. They're using it to probe into the flowers, and they suck up the nectar. They put it into their first stomach, and then when they fly back, they regurgitate it out. And you see a cutaway of that wax comb, the bees putting down that raw nectar from the flowers and fanning it down to make really delicious honey. When that gets thick, they put a capping over it, and it's the least processed food that there is today. All you do is take that wax away, you separate the wax from the honey, and that's what goes in the jar. I think many of you probably are aware, depending on what floral source the bees are visiting, it gives a different kind of honey. So you can go anywhere from the honey that comes from buckwheat, which is dark and medicinal, to fireweed, which makes this honey that's so light that you could read a newspaper through it and not even know there's a jar in the middle. So all of these floral sources produce a different kind of nectar. Okay. So here I want to talk about 4 other species that are not weird. This is kind of the typical thing that you would find in Oregon, in other states. These 4 other species are really common. So the first one is the bumblebee, and we're talking about multiple species. We have in Oregon alone, somewhere up around 30 species of bumblebees. And they've got some variations, but they all have a kind of similar life cycle. They start off as loners. So early in the spring, you see these big bees that are flying around. They don't have a colony yet. They come out, they've spent the winter in the ground. They come out of the ground and they zigzag around the landscape looking for the right size hole. Oftentimes it's in the ground. It's an abounded mouse nest. And they go out and they collect a bunch of resources. They make some of the wax, just like honeybees. As you can see, a little pot there next to where she's collected some pollen and laid some eggs. And what she does, she incubates that first clutch of eggs, and just like a chicken does. She's got a little groove in her body. She incubates it. She waits until they develop into, they're just about to develop into adults, and at which point that queen doesn't leave the nest again, and she has this whole array of workers that go out and function kind of like a honeybee colony, but at a smaller scale. They've got workers, they've got a division of labor. The colony grows, and then this time of year, and I'm sure in many states this is the case, here in Oregon it's been going on for a number of weeks. The colony produces males and virgin females. They mate, and then in the next month or so, these really large mated, we call them gynes, will find a place somewhere in, perhaps even in your garden. They'll spend the winter underground, and will stay there in a kind of hibernation until the next spring. And this is what it looks like when it's active. You can see in the middle there's the queen and all her workers. The wax doesn't look nearly as organized as a honeybee colony. And really, there's a little bit of honey there, but it's really not they never cure it. You can't, it's meant for immediate consumption. And we've got a lot of bumblebees. It's a temperate zone bee. And you can see the hot spot for bumblebees. So if you're colorblind, you may not see this, but the red color is really we have a real big hot spot around Northern California and Southern Oregon. So we're in a real great place here in Oregon for bumblebees. Okay, so to get at these other bees, you're going to pay attention. You need a little bit of taxonomy, but just a little. You don't need a lot. I'm going to give you just the basics. So if honeybees and bumblebees are, they're kind of similar. They make wax. They have colonies. They're also similar in that they carry their pollen in the same place. They both have this thing called a curbicula. It's a big word, but all it means is they've got a little basket on the back leg where they put the lump of pollen on their back leg as they're flying around. Now, not all bees have these curbicula, and you can use this as a way while you're walking around your garden to figure out who you're looking at. First thing is that male bees don't collect pollen at all. They don't do any work. So that's one distinction. If you don't see pollen on a bee, it may be because it's a male. The other thing is there are some bees like nest parasites. These are bees that don't actually, they find another nest of another species and they lay an egg in there. So they don't collect their own pollen. They're just kind of making their way on the labor of others. But also we have species, and this group is out right now, Haleus, that also they don't carry the pollen, they actually ingest the pollen. Okay, those are oddities. But when we look at the females, you're going to see two variations that are really important that you can use to identify the bees. And that is, these bees are carrying pollen on these dense mats of hairs. They're called scopal hairs. Don't worry about the term, it's not important. What is important is where they're located. So there's a whole bunch of bee species that have these hairs running up and up their leg, and up into their, right, close to their body on that back leg. But there's another group of bees, the big-lipped bees. We'll talk about them in a bit. I've heard them called as pollen bellies is another one, where they're carrying the pollen on their abdomen, and it's really distinct. Here, I'll show you a picture. So here we got a pollen belly or big-lipped bee of the from the family Megachilidae, and you don't need to know any of these names, but just notice the pollen is all on the abdomen. It's not like the other pictures we saw with the honeybees, where the pollen was on the leg. It's on their tummy, so to speak. So this group, we're cool bee number 3, actually. The big lip bees, it's a big group, it's a family of bees, there's a lot of them. And these key features are they're carrying the pollen, the females are, underneath their abdomen, on their belly. We have some managed species, as we'll talk about in a second, alfalfa leafcutter bees and mason bees. Beekeepers, there are people who keep these bees. And the thing that's really distinct about this group is they're able squatters. They repurpose material for building their nests. We're going to talk about another group that do something really different, but these ones are using material that's already out there to make their nests. And we have about 100 species in Oregon. So repurposing their nests, you can see here, these are leafcutter bees. You can see on the bottom right, they take a little chunk of leaf out, they fold it up, and then they put their babies in a little cell made out of those leaf discs. And you can see they'll use abandoned shells, they'll use twigs, they'll use anything that's sort of the right diameter to put their cells into. And here you can see leaf cutter bees. We've kind of oftentimes what they're looking for are these little holes that beetles bore into dead wood with. You can see here we've used a drill bit to do the same thing. And these bees can come up to very high densities. And you see this bee domicile is right next to a very busy place. We have high traffic at the university, and this is not a problem. These bees are not aggressive in any way or form. And you can see, just if you look at the edge of a lot of those little holes, there are cocoons. So really great bee, fun to watch, great pollinator, and so easy to incorporate into a garden. So if you look at these, the first kind of one I want to talk about that I'm sure a lot of you know about is the orchard mason bee. It's a bee that doesn't make its nest out of leaf, but rather, as you can see on the right, it's sort of jammed there. She's collecting a little bit of mud, and she takes that mud up, and as you can see on the bottom there, she finds a twig or something of the right diameter, channel of wood, and she creates a mud wall, which takes multiple trips for her to do, and puts the pollen in there, and then lays an egg, and then seals the cell off. That whole process, it has no division of labor. This is a solitary bee. There's no nest mates. It's just one female doing all the work. And notice that there's no like pot of honey, or there's no wax. This is very different from the bumblebees and the honeybees. I also noticed that Washington County is on the line, and then obviously Ron Spendel has been really an important figure in teaching and incorporating a lot of these bees into public displays. A lot of schools. Here you can see a picture that Ron took. He has a plexiglass nest, so he can watch very carefully what the bees are doing. He has very careful measurements on the activities of the bees. Makes for an amazing educational opportunity for public gardens. There's also a really great pollinator of particularly plants in the rosaceae. You can see as they're coming into this, I think, apple tree here, their abdomen is just positioned right on the stigma. They are really effective at transferring pollen in this group. This group also has some real curious bees. This is one that I love to watch. It's introduced bee, European wool carder bee. And you can see this bee is an extremely agile flyer. It looks just like a wasp, but it really loves lamb's ear. If you have lamb's ear, in our neck of the woods, you invariably will have this bee, and the males are highly aggressive and will protect that lamb's ear patch very studiously. So we have our first question here. So as Ron has wool carder bees in his channels, and you can see there is a clump of wool. They're putting their bees in a clump of wool, not in mud, not in leaf material. I got a poll question for you. What do you think that wool is made out of? So is it mouse hair to kind of find, they got a good sense of smell for mouse hair and they're collecting it? Is it that wool fluff that you get from cottonwoods? The fluff that comes off the cottonwoods, they sort of time well with it. Is it leaf hairs or is it wood fiber? Are they kind of like shaving down wood fiber? What do you guys think? What is the wool from the wool carder bee?
Votes are coming in, and looks like we're going to have a distinct winner here. But we'll take another 5 seconds. Okay.
Okay. All right. Wood fiber. That's a good guess, and that's how social wasps make their nest, the paper out of. But in fact, it's leaf hairs. Ooh. So you can watch these. It's really amazing. They've got all of these bees big-lipped. They've got really great mandibles, and they shave the pubescence off the bottom sides of the leaf. They don't damage the leaf at all, and they make this little ball of wool that they fly back and they make the nest out of. It's amazing. They're so fun to watch. Okay, so that was our first scopal hair group. The other one we're going to talk about, there's two other ones that are really identifiable. And here you'll see that the hair is running up the leg. And in this next group, that hair kind of runs up where their thigh would be, so it looks like they have pollen up their armpits. And this next set of group is really distinct because they make their nests in the ground. I'll tell you right now, 70% of the bees that we have, you've never seen. They make a small little hole in the ground. They're not social, so there's not a traffic jam coming in and out. Every 10 minutes the bee kind of goes in and goes in real fast. You never see it. Just a hole in the ground, and this bee is no different. This is the metallic sweat bee. It's a beautiful bee. You should all be able to recognize it. The males are the head and thorax is this emerald green, and then the back end is this kind of looks like a wasp that's striped. For most of the female species, they're all green except for this one here, virescens, which is looks more like a male. But they're really, really distinctive bee. They're really pretty. They're a little bit smaller than a honeybee. They nest in the ground, and you should in every state you'll see this bee. And I've seen them in back alleys. Like, they're tough. You've got them. Trust me. Just keep your eye out. Our fifth cool bee is the longhorn bee and the tried Eucerini. In Oregon, we're just seeing the last of these. This one bee, this sunflower specialist that we have, the Melisodes. It's a genera within the Eucerini. What's really distinct about them is they're kind of very Texan in that the females have these big fuzzy. Look how fuzzy the hair on the back leg is for collecting the pollen. They look like chaps, so they look kind of cowboyish. And the male has these strong antennae. So you see how long they are, just longer than their body, in fact. And this group is really keyed into anything in the sunflower family. So if you have a sunflower, you'll see these bees. They're so pretty. They're so fun to watch. And on a sunflower, you can get lots of long pictures because you can get in right behind them and take your shots. Okay. So 5 bees, we did it. Honeybee, pollen basket, honey, wax. They have they're highly social. They live in a colony. Bumblebee, they also have this pollen basket on their back leg. They also make wax, but they are distinct in that they're solitary to start at the beginning of the year. Then they make a colony, then they become solitary again. The big lip bees, remember, they're the ones that when you see them fly by, they're going to have some kind of pollen on the females on their abdomen. They may be carrying leaf, or they might carry mud, or they might carry a little bit of wool on their way back to the nest. They're solitary, so they don't have a colony, and they're squatters. They like holes, some kind of hole to make their nest in. You can also easily recognize metallic sweat bees. They're easy to see, green. They're going to have this, they're going to carry their pollen on their back legs. It's going to look like it's almost like creeping up their armpit, like they're going to have pollen going all up and down the leg. They're also solitary, and they're going to nest in the ground. And finally, I swear, you can, when you see this guy afterwards, you can tell him all 5 of these. Longhorn bee. Longhorn bee, huge, big antennas, and the female's got these chaps. They're also solitary, and they nest in the ground. So before we go on, is there any questions about these 5 bees and bee diversity? We're going to go on to the garden stuff next.
We just have one question, and you might get to it in your concepts. Richard would like to know about a backyard pollinator habitat certification program, specifically in Oregon. I guess he's seen some in other states like Pennsylvania. So if you're going to get to it later, that's fine to wait on that one.
I'm not going to get, I'm going to talk about habitat, but not around certification. There are a lot of initiatives, both at the municipal level, soil and water conservation districts, that are doing a really impressive work in being able to sort of identify the common elements of that would constitute wildlife habitat. And I think it's a really amazing initiative. I can't think this would have been something 10 years ago. But we'll talk about the elements of what constitutes habitat in a minute. But I think it's a great question, and it's a really great advance, something that's happened in the last few years.
And just one more before you move on. Nora wants to know why the bee is called a big-lipped bee.
One more time?
She wants to know, Nora would like to know why the bee is called a big-lipped bee.
Oh, that's a great question, big-lipped. So that's what actually the Latin megachilid translates into. And the reason that it's significant is, remember I told you these bees are, they're kind of manufacturers. They're masons, they're wool carders, they're leaf cutters. They got these mandibles that are really distinctive. Mandible means lip, I guess. You know, bees don't have real lips, but if you can imagine their mandibles, these 2 kind of mouth parts on the front of their head, they're doing all this work with these mandibles. And so they're kind of enlarged, and they're really agile. So I think that's where the name comes from. Great question. Okay, well, let's go on. We're going to now finish off with these 10 concepts for building pollinator habitat in your backyard. I think there's all sorts of detailed stuff that we can talk about, and I'm sure you all have experience with those details far more than me. But let's talk about the key concepts. Now, the real fundamental idea when it comes to bees, not like butterflies or maybe, you know, flies or other, is that they make a nest. So bees are going to make a nest, and when they make that nest, they have to have the right stuff to make the nest out of. If they don't have the right stuff to make the nest out of, then they're going to keep looking until they find something. So a good habitat has that nesting stuff there. And from when they put their anchor down and say, I'm going to make a house here, they have to have access to forage. And what forage to a bee is flowers. So they have to have access to flowers over the course of their lifespan. And when it comes to something like a bumblebee or a honeybee, they have to have food over the entire course of that colony's development. So those are the key concepts. You got to get the nesting stuff there. And when they put down an anchor, the worst thing that can happen is, like, you have it looks really good early in the spring. And they say, this looks like a good place. Look, they got the nesting substrate and they got the food right here, and then it just dies out. That can be really hard on a bee. So if you can put these pieces together with these 10 concepts, then you're golden. So the first idea is diversity of flower types. Having a lot of different flowers, because you'll find that for one thing, that question of being able to bloom over time. If you have different flower types, things bloom at different times. That's one idea. The other thing is not everything is attractive to the same kind of bee. We have a lot of bees. You've learned this in the first part. With 500 species in Oregon, they don't like to go to the same thing. Now, one easy thing to do, you can get a list, and those are really great, get a plant list, but you could also just walk around. Walk around and just look at where the bees are. And now, having done the first part of this course, that first learning objective, you now know that it's not just a matter of, is there a bee? Because I swear to you, there's a lot of flowers that honeybees will go to. Honeybees are very generalist. They'll go to anything, and they've got a pretty long tongue, so they'll cover a lot of flowers. But when it comes to some of these other bees, they're very picky, and you will only find them on a few flower types. If you just walk through these gardens and sort of pick out where's everybody going, that's a really good indication, probably the best in being able to come up with flower selections, especially ones that have the aesthetic that you want. Now, diversity of flower types also comes into play because some of our bees are specialists. Not most of them are generalists. They'll go to anything they can get their mouth through, but some have very plants and bees have evolved very complicated relationships. And this is a really great example. Charles Darwin would send specimens of this orchid from Madagascar in the 1860s. And what's really peculiar about it, as you can see in that slide where the arrow goes down, that's the nectary. So whatever pollinator was going to visit that thing had to have a tongue that was about 10 to 11 inches long. And so Darwin said, there's got to be something out there. And they found the moth. They found it. It was this really big moth, but it was in the Congo. They found it before, and they didn't find it in Madagascar till like 20 years later. And nobody actually saw this moth visit this flower until the 1990s. So the one thing I just want to, so here's the moth, just really big moth, really long tongue. The one thing I want to get across with this story is we don't know the relationship between a lot of flowers and bees to this day. There's a lot of unknowns in the bee world, and so part of it is if you plant diversity, you'll cover that off. You'll sort of fudge it a bit. You'll get a few more species, even if you don't know who exactly goes there. Odds are you can cover a lot more species off when you have diversity. Okay, that's the one thing. And when I mean diversity as well, it's making sure the plants are in different kind of plant families, but also different shapes of flowers. So some urn-shaped flowers, some that have like a pea-like flower are real specific to some bees. And also not just the flower type, how the flowers are arranged on the plant. Are they in a raceme? Are they single? Are they a composite? Making sure to get a variety of flower shapes. But I want to focus in on one thing specifically. It's the length of the length of the corolla where the bee will stick its tongue down. And I was recently, this really attractive ground cover, and I noticed that the only thing visiting this ground cover were very large bees. And it makes sense in a way, because you have to look how long that bee has to get her tongue down. Not all bees have very long tongues. I want to just take a little sideways journey through this slide. This is the only scientific slide I have, but it's a listing of bees that you find in the state of Maine. The top bee, Bombus fervidus, these are all bumblebees, by the way. The queens in general have longer tongues than the workers. You see the queen has a 14 millimeter long tongue, and the worker about 12 millimeter long. The next species down, this is another species of bumblebee, Bombus vagans, has a 2 millimeter, the queen has about 2 millimeters shorter tongue, and the workers can only get their tongue down 8 millimeters. And this is what they noticed on jewelweed in Maine. First thing in the morning, the bees with the shortest tongues, the Bombus vagans, would be on the jewelweed, getting their tongue down and getting the nectar down as far as they could go. And then what happened was the longer tongue bees would come up later in the day, because they could stick their tongue right to the bottom and clean the jar out, so to speak, and get all the rest of the nectar out. So making sure that you have different flower depths can do two things. One is accommodate these bees with different tongue lengths. But the other thing is set up a really great experiment that any master gardener could replicate by looking at how species use different garden plants. Love to see that. Here's another example of diversity of flower types. Here's a very common element. It's just it's starting to fade here in Western Oregon, black-eyed Susan and Russian sage. And if you were to walk through this very common kind of landscape design, you'll see a real partitioning of bees. So on the left, you can see on the black-eyed Susan, we have these longhorn bees, some ground nesting bees. And on the right, the honeybees, bumblebees, and you can see in the middle, this one big-lipped bee was just exclusively on it. So by having these different flowers in the garden, it really allows for these different species. You really start to attract these different species to your garden. The second principle is making sure, and I think we've already alluded to this, ensuring that the flowering overlaps. So remember, a bee's going to make a home. You want to support it through its entire life. So it should look like this in the spring, and then later in the summer, like this. And you're just constantly having something flower. And thanks to Polk County for these slides. This is from the Polk County Master Gardeners, I believe. Okay. Third thing is include native plants, not just exotics. This is a great study that was done in Berkeley, and you can see if you just randomly selected flowering plants that were exotic, about 7 or 8% of them would be attractive to honeybees and native bees, like a bumblebee. But if you randomly select native plants, 50% of them will be attractive to honeybees, and 76% of them will be attractive to bumblebees. So native plants, just better odds of getting something that will attract not just bees, but native bees. And I think one of the best examples here in Oregon is Ceanothus. Just you can see here this slide of a black-tailed bumblebee, the pollen just dripping off. You can find, easily 10, 12 species of bees on Ceanothus when it's in bloom. Such a excellent pollinator plant to have, and so pretty and fragrant. But we also, think about the exotic plants too. Here's a nice sweat bee just feasting on a dandelion. So there are exotic plants that are attractive. Another exotic plant that is tough as nails. Here you can see it outside of a storage facility. You find it in all sorts of parking lots. Cherry laurel, attracting all sorts of different bees. It's a very short corolla, lots of nectar, lots of bees will be attracted to it. Our fourth principle is if you are choosing exotics, make sure to use single-flowered cultivars. Here we have Rose of Sharon. It's a late summer flower, lasts into fall. It provides both nectar and pollen at a time of year in Oregon where we don't have a lot. But this single flower variety is attractive, whereas the double-flowered variety isn't. Fifth principle is don't forget the trees. Big leaf maple is a superb plant for pollinators, even though it doesn't really need the pollinators to set its seeds. A lot of things like Sergeant Cherry was here at OSU campus covered with bees. When you're planting, sixth principle, you want to do big patches of things. You want big contiguous. Bees like the big box store. They like a lot of flowers all together. They don't want just one flower. They like to kind of travel along the route. So plant in patches. 7, extend your blooms by deadheading. Get those flowers off, and that's going to lead to something else in a second. You can get a lot of these flowers just continuing to bloom. But if you deadhead, one thing you might consider, especially this time of year when you're pruning back, if you've got a hollow stem, if you can just leave it maybe 6 to 12 inches above the ground, that will provide nesting opportunities for a lot of our cavity nesting bees. And of course, you can also provide houses and channels. I've showed you the houses and also, just blocks of wood with holes in them. Here's a really great example. This is Dr. David Gordon showing us if you go to spirea, if you just don't prune everything right back, you leave some dead stems. You'll have here. This is Seratina. It's our small carpenter bee. It needs a dead stem, and you can see here he's showing you there's the larva of the bee packing its cell together with little bits of sawdust. So one principle is to garden for bees, you in some ways have to be just a little bit messy, just the tiniest bit messy, and that will help the bees out. Also incorporate some bare ground. I know mulch is really important for keeping weeds down, but this is a really nice element in Madras, Oregon. A person had put a rock garden down and gave me a call and just had these, you can see these wonderful ground nesting holes right on the edges. So on the edge of a path, a lot of on the edge of a rock garden can be really great nesting opportunities for our ground nester bees. And finally, the 10th one, use pesticides judiciously. So the very first thing is only plant plants that are attractive to bees and not prone to pests. If you you can really avoid the use of pesticides at the planting stage. There are a lot of plants that don't have pest problems. But if you inherit a problem, you've got a plant that just really does need a pesticide intervention, first thing is look for some other means, mechanical means, using water to control your pests. But if you do, try to select a pesticide that doesn't is not listed as being toxic. And if you have to use it, try to get the insecticide on after the petals fall. And when you're applying any kind of insecticide, just be careful. It's not just the plant you're targeting. If some of that spray lands on a weed that the bees are visiting, it will have a negative effect. And finally, we have this new issue with systemic pesticides, which is being used, especially when we have a lot of invasive pests in tree trunk injections. It's really important. Those pesticides can reside in the plant for some months later. If you do it just a few months before bloom, it invariably finds itself in the nectar. So the recommendation is to follow the label carefully and make sure all the petals have fallen off before anything's put on. And here in Oregon, we're acutely aware of this. We had a really terrible pesticide poisoning, spate of pesticide poisonings around a shade tree, linden. You can see it's highly attractive to bees. They love the flowers, but it has aphids that produce honeydew that get on your car. So they applied a pesticide, killed thousands of bumblebees, and these products now have these labels on, so follow the label. All right, so if you are looking for more information on pesticides, we do have a free app. If you go to Reduce Bee Poisoning for Pesticides, it'll go through each of the compounds and give you information on those pesticides. All right, so let's round this all up. What do we learn? Well, first thing, these 4 things: diversity of bloom, overlapping bloom, include native plants, and avoid these double petals. Second thing is don't forget about trees. Plant in big patches, deadhead flowers as they finish, and think a bit about nesting, above ground and below ground, and finally, judicious use of pesticides. So when we think about this question, in conclusion, never doubt how a small and thoughtful, committed pollinator habitat in your backyard can change the world. I want you to think about the master gardeners. So here we have, again, Washington County, excellent pollinator habitat incorporated with an education center, educational display, really effective. Lynn County has this really wonderful annual pollinator event, conference, Bee-Vent, which will be happening again this spring. And then we've been working with a lot of the master gardeners here at Klamath County on getting people trained up to identify bees and be able to supply information back to a statewide atlas. And with that, if you have any questions, we can round the webinar out.
So while people are entering their questions that they have in the Q&A, there's a few that are in the queue there. Christina would like some tips on encouraging bumblebee nesting. Do you have any specifics that might help her?
Yeah, when I first got here, I got a whole bunch of these bumblebee boxes and put them in the ground. So the thing is that these bees nest in the ground. And there is the case that we know in Oregon, where we have grass seed fields, for example, we have very high density of nests because there's a lot of mice that go in the grass seed fields and dig holes. I've also heard that bumblebees are attracted to compost piles and things like that. So you can encourage them. You can try to put these nesting boxes in, but I'll tell you, if you do put nesting boxes in the ground, and I'm talking about a box the size of a shoe box with a little PVC pipe that comes up to the surface, it's tricky. It's really hard to encourage them to nest where you want them to nest. And when it comes to bumblebees, I think it's a tricky question. It's not nearly as easy as it is with some of those big-lipped bees, the megachilids.
And just a practical, just to add to what you were saying, it's interesting you say that. We have the little, the little animals here, and the names are escaping now. Anyway, they bore a lot of small holes in my yard, and so I've got a ton of little like vole holes all over the yard, and I have a ton of bumblebees here, more so than any other place I've ever lived. So I think that sort of backs up what you're saying with regard to if you have existing holes in your yard, then.
The only thing I will say is that they do like tufts of grass. So the other thing I've heard is that they do like a kind of grassy meadow. That different species have different nesting requirements, but for a lot of them, they like to be a little bit hidden. So.
Jennifer has an interesting question, and I know you were just at the Far West show up in Portland, which is for our commercial nursery and greenhouse industry. So she says that since breeders are looking for color and these perfect blooms for consumers, is this affecting the quality of the nectar or the pollen that's available? And maybe what is that industry looking at?
Yeah, I know, that's a great question, and I don't think breeders are looking for nectar and pollen quality. I know this from an agricultural question where we were working with canola breeders, and they're looking for other characteristics, and it's not necessary that they are connected. And I think the double petal example is a really great one where when you have a double petal plant, as I understand it, it just makes the nectaries completely difficult to get at, and it grows. It's like it comes at the expense of the pollen producing organs. So there's a very real large risk of that. And I do think, again, role of master gardeners in educating the public on plants that are the desirability of having bees come to your yard and to watch them is paramount.
A couple more creeping in. Susan, and you may or may not know this, Susan would like to know, she's seeing a lot of crepe myrtle trees, and she's just interesting if the bees like them because they seem to be pretty tough and grow well.
I'm not
Question.
sure. I'm not sure. Full admission, I'm cribbing on. I'm really relying heavily on my master gardeners in the state to help me learn gardening.
You're an entomologist, right? Yeah.
I'm an entomologist, yeah.
Do you have any, Martha wants to know about how different bee species, how they handle summer heat. So she's in Colorado, they can get some pretty good heat waves. We get some here in Oregon too. Is there anybody looking at how bees are responding to summer temperatures?
I mean, no, I don't know anybody who's looking at that question. There's a lot of people who are modeling climate change and trying to figure out how that is going to affect bee communities. But most of it is on the flowers, how those flowers perform. And I think I heard a really interesting presentation recently, or it was actually conveyed to me by Gail Longolato, our master gardener coordinator, where she said, there's a study in Phoenix that showed that bee diversity in xeric gardens, low water gardens, was higher than they were in highly watered gardens, which I thought was remarkable. I thought bees would really love like a really lush garden. And so the one thing that sort of came across to me there is that, bees, may be adapted to those kinds of landscapes. And what we really need to think about is creating the kind of garden that can perform well still under heat stress. That might be, to flip the question around, it might be a matter of just making sure those flowers are around. Of course, honeybee colonies can get hot, and they do need a source of water when it does get hot. They can cool themselves down, but if there's no source of water close by, then it can become a problem.
We have time for probably one more question, and so I see two that are somewhat related. So Linda says she sees bees coming back to the same flowers during the day, and she wants to know, do the flowers produce more nectar? Does it get used up? I mean, how does that nectar source within the flower work? And are there maybe even some that have a higher refresh rate? That was another question.
Yeah, they do, and some of them turn off. Buckwheat's a great example. Buckwheat stops producing nectar in the afternoon. So honeybees that are on a buckwheat field get cranky in the afternoon because everything stops. We saw with the bumblebee tongues, there's a way in which even if the flowers aren't refreshed, there's bees with short tongues take the top half, and then the longer tongue bees come in later and get the bottom half. Most of the bees that we have are short-tongued. Most of the bees we have don't have very long tongues. Honeybees and bumblebees are weird that way. And they are species specific. Some have a high refresh rate and some don't. And the other thing I'll say is that not all plants produce nectar. Poppies are a really great example of a plant that has no nectar but just produces pollen.
Looks like we're at our time here. I know there's quite a few more questions, so we might have you take a look at those, and maybe we can answer them offline, and maybe do a little summary and post those up on the Learn page, if that's okay, so we can keep ourselves on time.
Definitely, and I'll just say we do have Facebook and social media, so if you want to post stuff there or the email, just send me a note. I'd be happy to answer it.
I'm going to put a link real quick to folks in chat. Actually, it's just, I don't know if this is the time of year to think about pollination, but I put a link to a Learn event, All Bugs Good and Bad. Most of those folks are in Alabama and in the southeastern part of the United States. Did a talk very similar to what we've just had here. So if you're curious and if you liked what you heard here, I'm sure you'll like this also.
And so we'll wrap that up, and we'll say thank you. And you probably can't hear all the clapping from across the U.S., but thank you very much. Our next webinar in the Master Gardener series is on Japanese beetles, and that's on Tuesday the 19th, same time, 1 p.m. Pacific. Thanks so much for attending.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.